Hi friends, just before we dive into today's episode, I want to ask a huge favor from you. Would you please consider being a supporter of the Why Catholic podcast? There's 4 ways you can do this. First, you can become a patron and financially support this podcast. The basic level is $5 a month. To become a patron, go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Secondly, you can support this podcast by purchasing something from the Why Catholic merch shop on Etsy. Just go to etsy.com/shop/whycatholic. Third, you can also support Why Catholic by sharing episodes with your community. And lastly, you can support Why Catholic by inviting me to come and speak at your next parish event. For more information about that, please send me an email at whycatholic@substack.com. Thank you, friends, for your help. I couldn't do this without you. In 70 AD, following the Jewish rebellion against the Roman occupation, the future Roman Emperor Titus began besieging Jerusalem 3 days before Passover. For months, the Roman army assaulted the city of Jerusalem until they were finally able to break through the walls. Once they gained entrance, all hell broke loose. They set fire to the city and completely destroyed the temple. According to the historian Josephus, 1.1 million were killed in the siege of Jerusalem, most of them Jews. An additional 97,000 were enslaved, and there were only about 40,000 survivors, and the emperor allowed them to go wherever they chose. The nation of Israel was no more. It wasn't until almost 2,000 years later, in 1948, when the UN recognized the state of Israel, that the Jewish people had an unoccupied land once again to themselves. Over the years, more Jews have returned to Israel, and just in the past few years, Israel now has the largest concentration of Jewish people. But there is one major thing missing from Jewish life, something that has been missing since 70 AD, the temple. There's been talk to rebuild a new temple in Jerusalem, but there's just one problem. The very place where they need to build it is occupied by a mosque, a very important mosque for the Muslims, the Dome of the Rock. Why can't the Jewish people just build a temple anywhere? The answer has to do with that rock that's inside the Dome of the Rock. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Today, we're going to begin a new series on the Papacy, Papacy meaning the office of the Pope, or also called the Bishop of Rome. What's unique about this topic is that it's distinctly Catholic. For many of our episodes, you might find some overlap between what Catholics and other groups of Christians believe. But the papacy? This is the only one of the big practices that separates Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So being that it is one of those hot-button topics with non-Catholic Christians, I can imagine that this series will get lots of attention. And trust me, I want to answer all the questions: the biblical case for the Pope, the primacy of the chair of St. Peter, the role of the Pope, etc. But before I can do that, I have to tell you a number of stories to help set the context. As I've often done on this podcast, I've begun talking about various Christian topics by talking about the context of Christianity, which is Judaism. Today, I want to talk about a number of Jewish images related to the papacy. And to begin, we have to start 2,000 years before Christ, or some 4,000 years ago. Genesis 22 tells us that God told Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. This was a rather extraordinary request because Abraham was over 100 years old, Isaac was his only legitimate son, and God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. So unless God had some trick up his sleeve, for Abraham to kill Isaac meant the end of his line. God told Abraham to travel with Isaac to a distant mountain that he would show him, and eventually he ended up at the top of Mount Moriah. There at the top of the mountain was a stone slab. Abraham laid Isaac on top of it and prepared to sacrifice him. However, an angel of the Lord told Abraham to stop and drew his attention to a bush where a ram was caught by its horns. God praised Abraham for his willingness to offer Isaac, but it proved to be merely a test. Abraham, relieved he didn't have to sacrifice his son, grabbed the ram and sacrificed it in place of Isaac on that stone slab. Now, you may have heard of the Jewish holiday Rosh Hashanah, which occurs in early autumn. The term literally means head of the year. It's the celebration of the new year for the Jewish people. In the Bible, it has another name, the Feast of Trumpets. Whenever I talk about Jewish feasts, I like to preface it by saying that Jewish feasts accomplish 5 purposes. First, they reveal the nature and character of God. Secondly, they commemorate an historic event. Third, as any national holiday does, they serve to unite a people and create a culture. Fourth, they prophesy the coming of the Messiah. And fifth, they point to end times. Rosh Hashanah has 2 points of historical significance. On one hand, it is the celebration of the creation of the world. On the other hand, it is the celebration of God rescuing Isaac from being sacrificed by his father Abraham. Now, that may seem like an odd mixture of symbols, but it all revolves around that stone slab. You see, that stone slab has a special name. It's called the Even Shetiyah, which means the foundation stone. I want you to remember that. It's not just some rock. It's a really important rock. In fact, I don't think many Christians understand just how important that rock is in Judaism. According to rabbinic tradition, that slab was the stone on which God initiated the creating of the universe. The way they see it is that stone was the center point of creation. So just imagine this. God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, but he makes him travel for 3 days to some random mountain, a place that meant nothing to Abraham, but it meant something to God. And God, who is just a master at poetic imagery, is going to bring the slab up over and over in redemption history. Now, I mentioned that Rosh Hashanah goes by another name, the Feast of Trumpets. And you might be thinking, what has any of these things got to do with trumpets? But I don't want you to think of our modern brass trumpets. Think about the ancient Jewish trumpet, the shofar, which is a trumpet made from a ram's horn. Why is that significant? Because Isaac was saved by the ram caught by its horn in the thicket. And so for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish people play a particular sequence of shofar blasts to celebrate the God who provides, which is what Abraham called that mountain, Jehovah Jireh. On the mountain, God will provide. Nearly 1,000 years later, history returns to that mysterious mountain because it's on that mountain where the city of Jerusalem, Israel's capital, was established. And during the reign of Solomon, King David's son, Solomon oversaw the construction of the temple. The temple, which followed the same layout as the tabernacle, had 3 parts to it: the outer courts, the holy place, and the most holy place, or sometimes referred to as the Holy of Holies. The further you went into the temple, the more exclusive it was. The innermost chamber, called the most holy place or the Holy of Holies, was the most sacred space in the entire world, and as such, it was off limits to everyone except for one person on one day each year. On Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would sacrifice a bull for the sins of all of Israel. He would carry the blood of the bull in a bowl. He would carefully enter the most holy place. He'd fill it with incense from a censer, similar to when priests use censers in the Mass. And then he would sprinkle blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant. This was the one time each year someone was allowed to enter that sacred chamber. Now, I mentioned the Ark of the Covenant, and if you're not familiar with this, I have a couple of videos in the show notes, along with a link to episode 4, or you can also watch Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark of the Covenant was Israel's most sacred artifact. It was a gold chest with a lid, and on top of the lid were 2 angels with wings stretching towards each other. The top of the ark was called the mercy seat. This is where God concentrated his presence on earth, and this is where the high priest sprinkled the blood from the animal sacrifice to make atonement for his and all of Israel's sins. Now, the Ark of the Covenant didn't just sit on the floor. No, the inner chamber was built around a special rock, a slab, and you've probably guessed the significance of the slab. Yes, it was the Even Shetiyah. It was the slab where God initiated the creation of the world and where Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice. So here we've come full circle. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, God pardoned Isaac through the sacrifice of the ram on the Even Shetiyah. And in the temple period, God pardoned Israel through the sacrifice of the bull and the sprinkling of the blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant, which sat on the Even Shetiyah. So when I say that we have a poetic God, this is what I mean. The exercise of offering Isaac as a sacrifice on some distant mount wasn't just for Abraham's benefit. It was for all of mankind's. It was meant to show us who God is and how he provides for us. Now, in 587 BC, the Babylonians invaded Israel and destroyed the temple. According to 2 Maccabees, the prophet Jeremiah had a vision of the invasion and took the ark and hid it in a cave in Mount Nebo. And when people couldn't retrace their steps and find it, Jeremiah was like, good, let it stay hidden until the Lord tells us what to do with it. The temple was eventually rebuilt 71 years later in 516 BC, which we read about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And during the reign of Herod the Great, just prior to Jesus' birth, the temple was enhanced. However, what about the Ark of the Covenant? Well, from what we know, there was no Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place during that second temple period time. And instead, the high priest on Yom Kippur would enter that inner chamber and sprinkle blood on the stone slab, the even Shetiyah, where the Ark of the Covenant used to sit. This continued to be the practice until the city of Jerusalem, along with that second temple, were completely destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, which I talked about at the beginning of this episode. Since then, there has been no temple, and since there is no temple, there have been no sacrifices. So now that the Jewish people are back in Israel, why haven't they built a third temple? Well, it's not just about building a temple wherever you want. The most holy place, very specifically, needs to be built around the even Shetiyah. And wouldn't you know that there is another building in that very spot where the temple existed, an Islamic sacred site known as the Dome of the Rock. It's called that because in the center of that mosque is a rock. Muslims believe that their prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven on that rock. And wouldn't you know, it's the very rock that's sacred to the Jews. It's the even Shetiyah, where Abraham offered Isaac, where the Ark of the Covenant used to sit, and where the high priest would sprinkle the blood from the Yom Kippur sacrifices in the time after the Ark of the Covenant was hidden. So for the Jewish people, it's not just merely about building a third temple, which wouldn't have even been possible until they were given back their land in 1948. Where would they build that third temple? They would need to build it around the even Shetiyah. And for that to happen, the Dome of the Rock would need to be demolished. And let's just say an act like that would result in World War III. Now, I want to switch gears a bit and talk about another important image, the imagery of keys. There were thousands of priests who served in the temple, but one priest would be in charge of overseeing the sacrifices and the security of the temple. The priest with the keys was called the Segen HaKonamim, which in Hebrew means the prefect of the priests, or in Greek it's translated as the captain of the temple. And according to Jewish tradition, that priest's duty included unlocking the temple in the morning and locking it back up at night. And according to the Mishnah, the keys were attached on a hook on a stone slab, and when it was time to go to bed, the prefect of the priests would take the keys off the slab, go and lock up the temple while the Levites slept outside, and then he'd put the keys back on the stone slab and put his mattress over the keys and sleep inside the temple. According to rabbinic tradition, when Jeconiah was about to be taken captive by the Babylonians during that siege in 587 BC, and the temple was about to be destroyed the first time, quote, he went with the keys of the temple to the top of the house and threw the keys down, saying that he delivered them up to God, who would appoint a worthier man to take charge of them, end quote. Numerous rabbinic traditions record this idea that the keys were taken up to heaven miraculously and mysteriously. The whole idea behind the tradition is that Israel failed to be faithful, which is why God sent judgment in the form of the Babylonians. And so the leaders of the temple took the keys and gave them back to God. And one day, someone worthy would come with the keys. And as Jeremiah noted, one day God would also bring someone to find and bring out the Ark of the Covenant. And who do you think they might be referring to? The Messiah. When you read the Gospels, you'll notice that there are a number of times when Jesus is hanging around the temple, and all of a sudden, the religious leaders start pressuring Jesus to tell them plainly if he's the Messiah. Why? The answer is that there was all of this rabbinic tradition surrounding how the Messiah would restore the temple, the keys to the temple, and particularly the Ark of the Covenant. We've talked about the imagery of the rock, the keys, and the captain of the temple who is the key holder. I want to talk about another aspect related to the Jewish roots of the papacy, and that is the prime minister. In Hebrew, the title is Asher al-Habayith. He is the royal steward, the person in charge when the king is away. Now, during the reign of King Hezekiah, the Asher Halbayith was a man named Shebna. However, in Isaiah 22, we read that God rejected Shebna. God tells him, quote, I will thrust you from your office and you will be pulled down from your post, end quote. Then God explains that he will replace Shebna with Eliakim. Quote, on that day I will call my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and will clothe him with your robe and bind your sash on him. I will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and no one shall shut. He shall shut and no one shall open. I will fasten him like a peg in a secure place, and he will become a throne of honor to his ancestral house. And they will hang on him the whole weight of ancestral house, the offspring and issue, every small vessel from the cups to all the flagons." End quote. So God replaced the prime minister Shebna with Eliakim. And as the new Asher al-Habayith, he gave him a number of items that demonstrated that authority: a robe and a sash, keys to the house of David. He is a father to the Jewish people. And with that comes this authority to open and shut. Let's recap these images. The captain of the temple, the prefect of priests, or in Hebrew, the Segen Hakanamim, was given keys to open and shut the temple. He oversaw the sacrifices, and on Yom Kippur, he had the responsibility of entering the most holy place and sprinkling the blood on the Ark of the Covenant, which sat on the foundation stone, the cornerstone, the even Shetiyah. We also have this imagery of the prime minister, the Asher al-Habayith, the person in charge when the king was away. He wasn't just some politician, he was meant to be a father figure for Israel, and he too was given keys with the authority to open and shut. So now let's look at how all of this Jewish imagery applies to the Pope. And to do that, we're going to look at Matthew 16. Starting in verse 13, we find out that Jesus and his disciples are in Caesarea Philippi. This was in the northern part of Israel. Today, it's right on the border of Lebanon. In Caesarea Philippi, there was this giant rock face, like a plateau that formed a cliff. And carved into the rock face were little shrines to various gods. And it's in this vicinity that Jesus asks his disciples, quote, "Who do people say that I am?" End quote. The disciples give a variety of answers. Quote, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets, end quote. So Jesus asked them, quote, "But who do you say that I am?" End quote. It's here Peter gives an important answer. Quote, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," end quote. Now, up until this point, Peter's name wasn't Peter. It was actually Simon. And Jesus, pleased with Simon's response, decides to bless him. And as often happens in the Bible, when God blesses someone, he changes his name. He changed the name of Abram to Abraham and Jacob to Israel. Listen to what Jesus tells Simon. Quote, "And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." End quote. What do you notice about the imagery in this statement? First, there's the rock that will be the foundation of Jesus' church, keys to the kingdom of heaven, the authority to bind and to loosen. And who is this authority given to? It's given to Simon. In fact, Jesus emphasizes it with a name change. He changes Simon's name to Peter, or Petros, which means rock. Jesus literally said, "Hey, Simon, we're all going to call you Rock from now on." Turns out the wrestler turned actor The Rock doesn't have an original name after all. Now, these are deep Jewish ideas and imagery. For us, this may not mean a whole lot, but for Peter and the other 11 disciples, all Jews, by the way, standing around Peter and Jesus, they would have immediately understood the significance of this moment. Jesus was making Peter second in command. He would be the prime minister who would rule once the king left. He was given the keys. Jesus was making Peter the prefect of the priests. And to accentuate it, he even changes Simon's name to Peter, or Petros, which means rock. On this rock, on you, Peter, I will build my church. Many Protestants often ask Catholics, where in the Bible is the idea of the papacy? They'll say, I don't see the Pope in Scripture. While the office of the papacy has certainly evolved over 2 millennia, its foundations are entirely scriptural. And like we see with anything important in the New Testament, we find that there are shadows of it in the Old Testament. Earlier, I said that God is poetic. And so I think it's important to ask yourself, why would God go through great lengths to imagine things in the Old Covenant only to completely abandon them in the New Covenant? For example, does it make any sense that God told Israel to make this elaborate gold chest called the Ark of the Covenant with 3 specific items inside and a cover where the high priest sprinkled the atoning blood only to have it disappear and never be relevant again in the new covenant? Or does it make more sense that it was a foreshadow of something relevant to the Messiah? When you listen to episode 94 on Marian typology, is it any wonder why the church fathers called Mary the Ark of the New Covenant? Why would God go through great lengths to give us all these images like keys, rocks, opening and shutting, only to abandon them in the new covenant? Doesn't it make more sense that he, being the greatest poet of greatest proportions, would use them as foreshadows of his kingdom to come? So yes, the papacy is a biblical concept. It's deeply biblical. It's rooted in Judaism and in Jewish imagery, and it's why we believe not only in the papacy, but that Peter was the first pope. Our topic for next time. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.